The global conversation on a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific between China, Taiwan, and other Western countries has intensified in recent months. In this video, we'll take a look at one crucial aspect of this potential warfare: the global economic outcomes of a new conflict. One thing is certain: an event like a conflict in the Taiwan Strait will have ripple effects for the entire world. However, it's worth looking at how we got to a point where we're discussing potential warfare in the first place. What are the reasons that make the conflict more likely now?
The first is the general structure of international politics in the Indo-Pacific, the rising tensions between the US and China, conflict over who determines the structure of international security in the Indo-Pacific, also the economic structure globally, where Taiwan is certainly a focal point. It is a place that the US needs to defend if it wants to maintain international credibility vis-a-vis allies, but also a place that the Chinese Communist Party needs to integrate into the People's Republic of China if it wants to maintain legitimacy. And this is the primary tension that has been on the rise because both parties are feel they need to be strict and they need to be credible on Taiwan. But I think the ultimate trigger that made us all talk about potential Taiwan contingent scenarios and its economic consequences is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First of all, because it shows that the wars that seem to be very unlikely, essentially because of the economic interdependencies, can actually happen. There's been a number of people arguing that Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine is impossible because the connections in trade, energy, technology, and finance are so strong that Vladimir Putin will not dare to change the status quo, risking international sanctions. And this proved to be wrong. And that's the primary lesson that many stakeholders also in the Indo-Pacific, in Tokyo, in Taipei, in Canberra, or in the US now take into the account. But having said that, I think it's worth discerning between different types of scenarios that can actually happen. The level of interdependence in the Pacific is arguably way higher than in Europe, and the ones that we saw between Russia and the European Union. It was relatively easy to decouple from Russia in a matter of months through very harsh sanctions. In terms of China, we're talking about global value chains and production chains that are at the core of global economy. So this raises the stakes for actually both sides. With Taiwan being a peculiar element of those value chains, producing semiconductors that are essential for the production both in China and outside of China. So the stakes are very high, and I think this influences the strategic calculus of all parties, and primarily the People's Republic of China.
There is a number of potential scenarios for the conflict. They range from pushing the boundaries of what's possible without risking a full-scale escalation, involving economic and maritime blockades, spurring international tensions inside Taiwan, all the way to nightmare scenarios of a full-scale invasion. But is any of these conflict scenarios more likely?
It's hard to measure the probability here, but I think it's still interesting and important to try to visualize potential consequences here. And for the sake of the clarity, I think it's the best way is to divide those scenarios into two types. The first being things happening below the threshold of a full-scale escalation in the Indo-Pacific, a war between China, Taiwan, but possibly also Japan and the US, things that do not escalate up until this moment, but are irrelevant for the international economy nevertheless. There's a considerable impact on financial markets, on global trade, but things may go bad. The waves of economic risk increasing will ripple across the global economy, but they may cool down essentially at some point. The second group of scenarios are the nightmare scenarios, the worst case scenarios that are not most probable, but are still probable nevertheless, and I think we should think about them. These are scenarios that really affect the actual workings of China's economy, Taiwan's economy, and the whole Indo-Pacific, breaking of maritime routes, potential conflict that results in bombardment of factories, things that change the global status quo, both in terms of security and economy, in a very thorough way. And I think those two sets of scenarios result in very different types of economic consequences, but still the consequences that are much more profound and deep and long-lasting than the things we saw in Europe. After the Russian invasion, it's been tough. It's been tough for everyone, also for the Western markets, Western societies. But I think the potential scenarios happening in the Pacific, given how important this region is in terms of global value chains and technology flows, there and in the Pacific, the stakes are much, much higher for everyone.
Taking into account that the likelihood of a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait is significantly higher now than ever before, let's take a look at what would be the biggest global economic consequences of the conflict.
We are talking about possible military confrontation between two largest economies in the world, two largest trading nations, two superpowers. So obviously the economic consequences would be devastating for a globalized economy. And even milder scenarios could trigger very strong reactions of societies around the world, of course, investors, businesses, because there would always be a fear that the situation may escalate. Even in the milder scenario, there is increased possibility of using the codependencies of the economies, Chinese and American, and of course other Western economies. So even if there is not a military confrontation, but still the possibility of using sanctions, of using freeze assets, it's very, very disruptive to the economy. First of all, in any case, there would be a panic, that's for sure. If we are talking about the changing of status quo in Taiwan Strait, there would be a panic, both in international financial markets and among populations. So, in terms of financial markets, increased risk aversion. That means flows of capital from riskier assets to safe havens. Strong pressure to depreciate other emerging market currencies, but appreciation of the dollar. The collapse of stock prices, of bonds prices. Huge increases in prices of gold, energy commodities, and of course the dollar. There will be a reaction of societies. Bank runs, shopping of everything we need in case of emergency, gas stations run out of gas. So huge impact, indirect impact, even before the direct impact of escalation in Taiwan Strait occurs. If the situation stabilizes, the shock should be temporary. In the medium term, the direct impact of the conflict kicks in. China is known as the factory of the world, the largest exporter in the world, the second largest importer. Taiwan, major producer of the most important so-called commodity of 21st century, semiconductors. Taiwan produces over 90% of most advanced semiconductors and over 1/3 of all semiconductors. And we use them basically everywhere. Automotive sector, renewable energy, electronics, of course. So we are talking about basic, really basic stuff.
With today's economies being so intertwined, the global economic outcomes of the conflict would be especially consequential for the US-China trade relations.
In case of an escalation in the Taiwan Strait, we can expect that the West at least put some substantial sanctions on China. And Beijing could retaliate. So that would have a huge effect on the economies. What we can expect is that banks would basically stop financing international trade, which have huge impact. Nowadays it's about several trillions dollars a year of just trade financing by banks, which facilitate trade flows. We are talking about the substantial increase in the transportation costs, both in terms of fuel, because of the increased prices of commodities, and in terms of insurance, of course, due to the potential disruptions of maritime routes. There will be a huge impact on China's economy. As I mentioned, China is the largest trading nation, so the disruption in trade would impact the economy, of course, but there's a pressure on currency, on financial markets, on foreign investors. So basically we are talking huge capital outflow, if possible, of course, because Beijing would respond, trying to block it. There are many foreign investors in China, both in terms of direct investment and portfolio investment. So we can expect that in case of a big escalation, substantial escalation in Taiwan Strait, they try to take the capital and fly and leave China. So it would both impact China's financial market, but real economy as well. Obviously, China's economy and Western economies are very intertwined nowadays. The codependencies are huge. China is responsible for about 30% of industrial global production. So we can expect that in the event of a sanctions put on China by the West, Beijing retaliates and, for example, stop exports. And that would impact at least critical exports, and that would impact the Western economies too.
As we already heard, the economic impacts of the conflict would be global, but some economies might be hit harder than others. Which countries would be most affected by the conflict?
If we are talking about the economies which would be most affected, we need to take two factors under the consideration. First of all, dependency on China's economy, which we can evaluate, and that's fine. And the second of all, the reaction of the governments, basically. Because it depends how would Beijing retaliate if we sanction them. If we don't sanction them, maybe the retaliation would be completely different and we are fine. So it's both political and economical question. So basically, we should be prepared that Beijing is going to use economic codependencies to punish us and Western governments, Western economies. So what we should do is try to expand our possibilities, to expand the process of diversification, to expand industrial base, to expand our capabilities, basically, in terms of producing stuff which currently obviously comes from China, as it's way cheaper.
Having learned about the economic turmoil connected with the potential conflict, is it time we start bracing ourselves for the impact?
I think in terms of probability of some change of status quo in the Taiwan Strait, which is the euphemic way to talk about conflict, the probability is way higher than it was before. It's hard to tell which actual approach will the involved parties take, and essentially primarily China here. But I think the status quo is no longer stable. The foundations of the China-US relationship on Taiwan are no longer viable. US is much more vocal about the actual defense, boots on the ground of Taiwan. China is much more vocal of reunification, and interestingly, the Chinese leaders have dropped the phrase peaceful reunification in their official documents. That being said, I think all parties are very much careful. And the thing we saw in the last Biden-Xi Jinping summit in San Francisco, trying to put some guardrails on the relationship between the two, is a result of a strategic calculation of both sides that nobody really wants to things go uncontrollable. But that being said, I think in the following years, the probability of some form of a change in the status quo, that might be salami slicing, taking over some smaller islands, China testing the credibility and resolve of the US and US-led alliance system, or an attempt to change internal politics in Taiwan, maybe some scenarios of military drills that are long enough for us to accept that China has some say over how ships go around Taiwan or flights go. These are the things that I think are probable. And here, still, it does not mean that things will definitely escalate into a full-fledged war. I think there are some guardrails here. Even those small-scale scenarios will have tremendous effects on global economy, at least in the short and mid-term. So I think we should all brace for it. And I think in terms of how the global economy is functioning now, how global corporations and governments think of their relationship with China should be influenced by this kind of calculus. I think the risk is there, and it's much more profound and visible than 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, and it should be implemented into our thinking on how to deal with this region economically.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing to our channel to be notified about new stories from the region.